for the latest meeting of the National Cabinet. As you recall, this meeting was convened 2 weeks ago when we were facing a very serious set of circumstances, particularly here in Queensland and particularly in Greater Brisbane. And we agreed that we would need to meet again in a fortnight's time and hopefully not be in a position where we were dealing with an escalation of the crisis that we saw 2 weeks ago, and hopefully seeing the set of circumstances that we are now seeing today. This followed a month of combating outbreaks in New South Wales and Victoria, and successfully so. Australians have responded in these last few weeks, and indeed over about the last month and a half, in response to the outbreaks that we have seen in a way that we are very grateful for as Premiers, Chief Ministers and as Prime Minister. Queensland has responded, Greater Brisbane responded, in New South Wales they responded, in Victoria they responded. And as a result, right here, right now, so far, we have been successful in avoiding a third wave of the virus here in Australia. Now, there are no guarantees, as Professor Kidd will tell you, but as I met earlier this week with European leaders and the Prime Minister of Israel and others, and we've seen the terrible situation that they're facing in so many other countries, the response of the Australian people, the response of Australian governments, the outstanding work done by our contact tracers and the Australian people coming forward for testing and observing what were quite genuine restrictions on their mobility and other things that they could do. But those actions has once again put Australia in a very strong position. And I want to thank all Australians once again for your response. And we're not out of it yet. The virus still hasn't gone anywhere, and we need to maintain that vigilance. I was particularly pleased here in Greater Brisbane, where there had not been cases for some time, but the quickness of the response and the cooperativeness of the response in relation to that latest lockdown that we had here in Greater Brisbane. In Sydney and in Melbourne in particular, where much bigger cities in terms of inflow of people coming in, as we've seen, that has obviously put those cities under greater stress and strain. And so there has been a greater sense of awareness, of course, in those cities. But here in Brisbane, it showed that even though that hadn't been the case, people did respond very quickly, just as they had in Sydney, just as they had in Victoria. So we are very grateful for that. So now 5 days of no community transmission across Australia. We haven't got the updated figures of today. Professor Kidd was just checking on those before we came out, but I'm sure the states will be confirming those over the course of the day. And so 2 weeks on from where we were after the last meeting of National Cabinet, then once again I think we can show that the systems have been tested. Australians literally have been tested in large numbers, but we have passed that test over these several weeks and indeed over the last month. But it wasn't the only thing that came through over this period. Yesterday, we learned of the jobs figures of December, which showed 50,000 more Australians in jobs in December. What that says is the way that Australia, together, Commonwealth, together with the states and territories, have been fighting this virus, continues to save lives and it continues to save livelihoods. Today's meeting of the National Cabinet really, as a result, provided an update and an opportunity to discuss progress across a range of fronts. We reviewed the status of the situation for preparation for vaccine. We reviewed the arrangements as they relate to passenger caps coming into airports. We've made no changes there, but those arrangements go back to their earlier settings on the 15th of February, but there is the opportunity for me to engage with individual states and territories on a bilateral basis if we believe we can create additional capacity. But that is not an indication that that will occur, but we are seeking to have a flexible arrangement with states and territories between now and the 15th of February to meet those demands. Pleased to see that those Emirates flights have come back, only after a week or so of saying they'd go. We've got the other 20 flights moving, and we've been able to be quite successful in continuing to get many Australians home despite those challenges. Just to note that specifically, there have been 78,876 Australians that we've been able to get home since the 18th of September of last year, which is when the National Cabinet set that as an urgent priority. I note also that just under $20 million has already been paid out of that fund, the Special Overseas Hardship Fund, to support Australians both in getting home as well as supporting them in place where they may be and unable to be getting on a flight and coming back to Australia. So those arrangements, those additional 20 flights, they will continue as we work through these issues over the next month. The only other point I'd make, as a result of our discussions this morning, I mentioned when we were in Canberra 2 weeks ago that we tasked the AHPPC to look at the potential national position on mandatory requirements for particular occupations of people working with vulnerable workers, in particular, specifically in aged care. The AHPPC has not recommended to require that at this point. Obviously, the vaccines haven't started yet, but that is an item they'll keep under review. That doesn't mean to say that at a later point they may reconsider that, but at this stage, the rollout of the vaccine and the program there is deemed to be sufficient to ensure that the issues that would be present there would be accommodated.